Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 6. This week we will be talking about different forms of assessment, including chapters 9 and 10. So first we'll talk about intellectual and neuropsychological assessment, and then we'll get into personality and behavior assessment. In chapter 9, they discuss 3 different types of intelligence and cognitive testing. So first we have intelligence tests, we have achievement tests, and we have neuropsychological tests. So we'll spend some time talking about each of these. First of all, regarding intelligence, there have been a lot of conflicting views about how to define intelligence. This has been an area of interest in psychology even before clinical psychology started. How do we measure people's different capabilities? Back in chapter 2, when we were talking about the history of clinical psychology, we briefly discussed how before kind of the standardization of clinical psychology after World War II, most people who identified as clinical psychologists were still working in academia. And developing different assessments was a big activity at the time. So developing different ways that we can measure people's capabilities in order to help with things like school placement, special services in school, as well as job placement or acceptance into certain military positions, things like that. And so a lot of different domains have been conceptualized as being related to intelligence. Things like memory, attention, knowledge about things, or kind of the process of logical reasoning. These are all kind of been associated with intelligence. If you can think of other things that you kind of think of when you think of the word intelligence, feel free to comment them here. And then we'll talk about some different theories of intelligence. So historically, we've had 3 predominant theories of intelligence in psychology. So we have Spearman, who believed that intelligence is a singular characteristic. So Spearman believed that there was this thing that he called the G factor for general intelligence. And it's kind of just this unidimensional trait that people have. So everyone can be measured in terms of this general intelligence. And so with Spearman's theory, there's a big correlation between a wide range of abilities. And so, for example, you probably know some students who have always kind of easily gotten A's in all of their courses across subjects. So whether it's math or science or English, it's kind of all easy for them because they have this kind of high general intelligence. By contrast, we had Thurstone, who had kind of the opposite theory. So Thurstone was saying intelligence is many things. We can't measure it as just one thing, but intelligence should be defined as being numerous distinct abilities that actually have little relationship to one another. So Thurston would say that somebody who's really good at math, for example, it's not necessarily correlated with somebody who's really good at a literature class, for example, or athletics. So Thurstone was like pretty much the opposite of Spearman in saying that intelligence is made up of multiple abilities. So these were both 2 historical theories of intelligence. They kind of both did different research to kind of support their theory, but ultimately they were kind of combined into what we now call kind of like the modern theory of intelligence. It's called the Cattell-Horn-Carrel theory, which is, you can just call the CHC theory, which is really a combination of Spearman and Thurstone's ideas. And they say that intelligence is best stood hierarchically. So what this means is that they acknowledge that there is a singular G factor. There is this kind of broad intelligence that we can measure in people that is associated with a wide range of abilities. However, you can then, in the hierarchy, kind of break that down and look at people's broad cognitive abilities. So they broke these into 16 different areas. And these are things like general kind of like fluid reasoning or verbal reasoning skills, things like that. And then even further, they actually added kind of like a 3rd level to the hierarchy and identified a bunch of specific abilities that are then associated with these broader cognitive abilities. So the ability to actually kind of do specific functions would be associated with a broader cognitive ability. So for example, the ability to do algebra is probably associated with the cognitive ability of fluid reasoning, which is also associated with having a higher general intelligence, but they can be organized in this hierarchical way. And this is really helpful to know because modern intelligence testing that we're going to go over in this video are based on this theory of intelligence, that we can have a broad IQ score that is the broad G factor, but it can be more helpful to break it down and look at people's specific cognitive abilities. So the most common intelligence tests come from Wechsler. So these are what I would call the gold standard intelligence tests. And what that means in clinical psychology is that, it has a really good reputation and it's sort of the default that people turn to when they're choosing a test. And so we have three versions of the Wechsler tests. We have the WAIS, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. We have the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And we have the WIPSI, which is the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence. And so they're broken up into these three tests so that it can cover, a broad age range. But they're structured very similarly. So they have very similar subtests. They're scored in a very similar way. And they break down intelligence into very similar factors, such as verbal reasoning, fluid reasoning, processing speed, things like that. And so the Wechsler intelligence tests, they give you one full-scale IQ score. And so that's kind of like that Spearman's G factor, like a general intelligence score. However, they also give you composite index scores, such as verbal comprehension index, fluid reasoning index. And actually, if these composite index scores are very different from each other, then we often say that the full-scale IQ score is not valid. So somebody who maybe scores across the board in average range, their IQ score might be valid because their specific abilities are more comparable to each other. But for some people, they have kind of a lot of strengths and weaknesses, and they might be across the board. They might be kind of gifted in some areas and a little bit behind in other areas. And then we wouldn't say that one number can really summarize how well they can function. So the Wechsler tests, they are administered face-to-face, so in person. They're working on computerized versions, but as of yet, they're all still face-to-face and always one-to-one. So these are intensive kind of tests. They take a couple hours and it's always given to one client at a time. Each subtest is pretty quick, so ranging from 2 minutes to 10 minutes. Overall testing usually takes about an hour to 90 minutes. And then once the scores are produced, they are compared to a normative sample. And so when these tests are developed, they test them across the United States. They try to get a nice, big, diverse sample to test it in. And then each person who then takes the test is compared to other people in the US. And so these are the index scores that the tests provide. So you can see they're pretty similar. So for example, the WAIS, the WISC, and the WIPSI, they all give a verbal comprehension index. But for some of the areas, they break it down further for children. So adults get like a perceptual reasoning index. And then for kids, they break it down into visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning. So there are some differences there. But otherwise, you can see that they are very similar across the three tests. And there are a number of subtests that then go into these composite scores. So here's just some examples. There's more than that are listed on the screen. But for example, for vocabulary, you ask the client to define a word. For similarities, you give them 2 words. So a lion and a tiger, and you might ask, how are they alike? And a good answer would be just that they're animals or mammals. And it's trying to kind of see how they can kind of conceptually understand how 2 things are related. For information, it's based on general knowledge. So it's almost like trivia questions. Block design, we ask them to create a pattern out of blocks that are kind of different colors on different sides, and they need to rotate them to make the correct pattern. Matrix reasoning allows them to look at a pattern and there's a missing portion, and then they get kind of a multiple choice test to select the missing portion. Coding is a processing speed task, so they're asked to copy symbols in appropriate spaces according to a key, and they're asked to do this kind of as quickly as they can. And then digit span would be a test for working memory, and so it's asking people to hold numbers in their mind and repeat them back. So giving them a string of numbers and asking them to repeat it back. And so the Wechsler intelligence tests, part of the reason why they're such a kind of gold standard test is they're psychometrically supported. So, they've gone through a lot of testing and development. And so we can kind of say with a lot of confidence that they measure what they intend to measure, and they're doing that consistently. So they're both valid and reliable. They also have a wide range of clinical applications. So they're often used for intellectual or developmental disorder diagnoses. They can be used for educational and vocational planning, as well as school placement and qualification. So often these tests are used, for example, when a child is identified as potentially being appropriate for special education, they will often be given the Wechsler intelligence test. There's also more recently electronic scoring available. And so this helps with making sure that the tests are administered in a standardized way and that the scoring is standardized. It kind of reduces the human error, but they still need to be administered by a trained psychometrist. So it doesn't have to be a psychologist who actually does the administration, but it still needs to be somebody who's familiar with the rules of administration. Another popular test that also has a big history is the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales. And these are very similar to the Wechsler tests in many respects. So they follow the same hierarchical model of intelligence. They have strong empirical support. So similarly, they have good reliability and good validity. Some differences are they can be used for a wider age range. So they go down to age 2 all the way up to 85, and it's one test instead of being broken up into different tests. They also include norms for people who have specific diagnoses. So for example, you can test someone who has a diagnosis of ADHD and then compare their scores to other people with ADHD rather than just people who are in their age range. And it has more items at the extreme levels. So it can be potentially more useful for assessing very low and very high ranges of intelligence. So that brings us to our next category of tests, which is achievement tests. So an achievement refers to what a person has accomplished intellectually rather than what they could accomplish. So with intelligence testing, we're wanting to know what are their capabilities, what could they accomplish? Whereas academic achievement testing is more what have they accomplished, what have they learned in school? And so this is much more focused on specific academic tasks, such as reading, writing, and math. And in fact, the most common application of achievement testing is to assess for specific learning disorders. And this definition has changed over time. This is actually one of the things that has changed quite a bit across the different versions of the DSM. But essentially what this refers to is people who have lower levels of academic achievement than would be expected based on their intelligence. So the way that we diagnose a specific learning disorder is to give an intelligence test and an academic achievement test and compare. So if somebody is, let's say, average in their scores on an intelligence test, but then they're performing way below grade level, we can say it's not due to their capabilities because the intelligence test is telling us that compared to same age peers, they should be functioning on average. But their achievement, their academic abilities are below what would be expected. And this can help in determining whether somebody has a learning disorder. So some examples of achievement tests, these are some of the most common ones. We have the Woodcock-Johnson tests, the Kaufman tests, and the Wechsler tests. And so we'll talk about the Wechsler test today because the intelligence tests are commonly used. And so by using them together, it allows for kind of easier comparison. It actually provides like supplemental information for comparing the scores directly. And so the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, also known as the WIAT or the WIAT, it gives you a total achievement composite score, which is kind of like the achievement version of the IQ score. And similarly, it kind of breaks it down into composite scores. So it'll give you a reading score, written expression, mathematics, spelling, kind of these different areas. It can also break it down a little bit further. So, for example, if somebody is having trouble with reading, it'll break it down into kind of decoding versus basic reading versus like reading comprehension. And this allows for better assessment of things like dyslexia. And then lastly, the third area in this chapter is neuropsychological testing. And so neuropsych testing is used to measure cognitive functioning or brain impairment. And so this can supplement other methods of assessing brain irregularities, such as like an MRI or a PET scan. But it's often used for determining baseline abilities so that changes over time can be measured. So it might be used for patients who have dementia to track changes and their functioning. So how is their dementia affecting their ability to do certain tasks? It might also be used for patients that have medical conditions that might result in impaired cognitive functioning. So if somebody has something like multiple sclerosis or has had a stroke or even has had something like a traumatic brain injury, doing neuropsych testing will allow for identification of kind of where is the cognition impaired. So unlike intelligence testing, which is looking more at these kind of broad areas of intelligence, this is really more specific because it's trying to really localize where is the impairment in the brain and how is this impacting somebody's behavior. So the tests are a little bit more specific into things like motor control or working memory, or short-term memory, rather than things like verbal reasoning. Neuropsych testing can also be used sometimes for eligibility for academic and workplace accommodations. So oftentimes for kids, like initial entry into special education, they might just do an intelligence test, but to kind of really get a nuanced picture of what's going on, or if there are kind of, more unique cases, like if somebody has like cerebral palsy or kind of like a specific medical concern that's affecting their cognitive functioning, then they would be referred for neuropsych testing rather than just the intelligence and academic achievement testing. So we'll kind of briefly go over some different neuropsych batteries. You don't need to know the nuances of them because there's a lot to learn in this area. In fact, for people who become neuropsychologists, they usually do a number of years of postdoctoral training after they receive a PhD. So for this class, we're just going to kind of talk about like the big picture. What do these tests look like? But probably one of the most common ones is the Halstead-Wrighton Neuropsych Battery, also known as the HRB. So this is usually used for 15 and older, and it includes 8 different standardized tests. So these pictures are examples of 2 of those 8. So on the left, we have what's called the finger tapping test, which is looking at motor and processing speed. And the second one, we have trail making, which is looking at executive functioning. So the person is asked to kind of switch between numbers and letters. And then it's also looking at processing speed. So they're asked to do this task as quickly as they can. And so with these 8 tests together, it's considered to be very thorough, and it can provide very specific, detailed information regarding impairment related to very specific parts of the brain. And so because of this, it's the most empirically supported neuropsych battery. However, it takes a long time to administer, and it doesn't necessarily connect to common day-to-day tasks. So these are some of the critiques of this battery. We also have what's referred to as the R bands, so the repeatable battery for the assessment of neuropsychological status. And the R bands is a nice kind of broad measure of neuropsych ability. And so your textbook goes over some other neuropsych batteries that I encourage you to read about. But you can just know like the R bands is much broader. It includes things like visuomotor abilities, verbal skills, attention, visual memory. And the really nice thing about the R bands is it only takes about 20 to 30 minutes to administer. So by contrast, the HRB or the Wechsler test, each of these is going to take like over an hour to administer. And so when you're giving somebody, multiple tests, so I actually work for a neuropsychologist sometimes, and oftentimes I'm with a client for 4 hours because if you want to include kind of all these different components, it's going to take quite a long time. So the nice thing about the R bands is that it's much quicker. But because of that, it might not be as comprehensive as something like the HRB. But it will give you a similar kind of hierarchical total score, 5 index scores, and 12 subtest scores. There is also a Wechsler test for memory, so the WIMS. This is used for people ages 16 to 90 who might have memory impairment. Again, this is quite a long test. It takes about 90 minutes to administer, and it's really only focused on memory, but it's nice to use for somebody where, there's already kind of a lot of evidence that memory is kind of the concern. So this can be used in conjunction with the other Wechsler tests to really kind of gather more information about in what areas is memory impaired. So visual memory and auditory memory might be different. And so this can be really helpful for use in diagnosing someone with a dementia disorder. Then we have the MoCA, also known as the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And I don't believe this is included in your textbook, but I wanted to include it here because unlike a lot of the other tests that we've discussed, this is actually one that I can share with you. So a lot of these tests are not allowed to be kind of released to the public, and that includes students. So until you're like in a graduate program and kind of been given permission to see this testing material, you're not really allowed to look at it. And so that's why I'm kind of telling you about the tests, but I'm not really showing you like specific items, for example. But the MoCA is used to screen for mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of like a precursor to a dementia disorder. And so this is often used in medical offices, such as like a primary care doctor clinic, to identify clients who might be good to refer to a neuropsychologist for more further testing. So MoCA doesn't take very long to administer. And so to give you an idea of what some of these tests look like, I put another video on perusal of somebody administering the MoCA. And it's pretty similar to how a lot of these other tests are administered. It's just a much shorter, kind of brief screener that can be used.